Well, good morning, and if I could welcome everyone to the campus of George Washington University. Thrilled to be able to host today's event on Romania with Ambassador Maior. But maybe before we kick off and before I introduce the ambassador, a 2-second snapshot on our series. This is a new series. And these are international leaders from a cyber perspective. And we've hosted over the years many leaders from countries such as US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, obviously our Five Eyes partners, but also Estonia, Israel, Japan, Singapore, and many others. But I thought we would build on a series we did in the early 2000s, and that was a roundtable series on counterterrorism. And at the time, I think counterterrorism demanded an international response, and I couldn't think of an issue that also demands an international response like cybersecurity. Thrilled in particular for today's event, Romania. Which I had heard from all of my colleagues over the years at NATO and at Europol and obviously in the BILAT environment, that Romania is a country that pound for pound, or maybe more aptly kilo for kilo, punches way above their weight when it comes to cyber-related issues. And I had the privilege to recently visit Bucharest and meet with a number of the ministers with portfolio in cyber from the security services, from law enforcement, and from military. And I have to say I came away really impressed. Not only technologically speaking, and they are doing some really neat things in the technology domain, not only have they structured and organized things in an innovative kind of way, but most importantly, the people. I found the people to be innovative. I found the people to be entrepreneurial and incredibly dedicated and devoted to not only their national interests, but to cyber. And I was happy to say to the BILAT with the United States. So I think you're going to see more and more countries emerge, but ultimately it really does come down to the people getting things done. And one of those architects is with us today, Ambassador Maior, who has a distinguished career as a diplomat, but not only as a diplomat. He sort of seems to always get the position that demands the greatest attention at that time. He served at the Ministry of Defense as Romania was ascending to NATO membership, and obviously did a phenomenal job there. He has served in various diplomatic issues, was elected to the Senate, where he oversaw a whole host of the national security related issues for Romania. And I think most importantly, he served as the director SRI, or the Romanian Intelligence Service, for 8 years, elevated the service's capabilities dramatically, but I think also did it in a way that is in accordance with democratic principles, and also brought in a ton of reform to the service. And I think he deserves a ton of gratitude for that. And while he's got more awards than I can list or count or discuss here, including knighthood and what have you, there was one that stood out for me. Just this past year, Director Pompeo, the Central Intelligence Agency, awarded Ambassador Maior the Warren Medal, Earl Warren Medal, which underscored the importance that the United States intelligence community saw our collaborative relationship with Romania. And lest I've not mentioned, he is also a professor, pursued his PhD, but I think most importantly for us today, he also has a degree from the George Washington University, where he received his LLM. So it's always great to be able to host a alum. He's going to speak for 15-20 minutes, then we're going to engage in a Q&A. Ambassador Maior, thank you for your service, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Frank. Indeed, it's a great pleasure for me to be back at GW, first and foremost. But before entering the subject and discussing this important topic, let me just say a few words on a sad announcement on behalf of Romania. 2 hours ago, it was officially announced that former King of Romania, King Michael, passed away at the age of 96. He's an historical figure, not only for Romania, but for US-Romanian relations, because during World War II, he was head of state. He managed to pull out Romania out of its alliance with Nazi Germany and join the alliance with US that led to the shortened of the war, according to some historians, with at least 6 months. He was a tragic figure because he also tried to oppose communism and the installation of communism in Romania. After 45, then he went into exile, and then he got back to Romania after the fall of communists after 1989. So may he rest in peace. Thank you for this digression. First, let's now get back to our business. First of all, I'd like to say it's a great honor to be giving a keynote address on behalf of Romania at the launch of this extremely relevant initiative. And I would like again to especially thank Professor Frank Cilufo for this opportunity. Knowing you, Frank, I have all the good reasons to expect this Cybersecurity Leaders Forum to become a timely, relevant and engaging avenue to exchange and broaden our knowledge about a topic that, of course, impacts our everyday life. Now I have structured my presentation into 3 parts. First, I intend to speak about the current state of cyber threat environment and share some of our threat analysis. Then I will present Romania's own responses and initiatives in the cyber field. And finally, I will touch upon the relevance of international cooperation and exemplify with the work currently underway as part of the Romanian-US strategic partnership in this field. Because today we are talking about the security aspects of cyberspace, I would like to frame the discussion about the security through the answers to three sets of questions. In very short language, they refer to what is there to protect, against whom, with what kind of strategies. In answering the first question, we need to consider that we have now reached a stage, I think all of you agree with this, where our lives, health, prosperity, well-being, and our critical values can be disrupted not just through attacks against what is called critical infrastructure, but against a very expansive list of soft targets. Just consider the pervasive use of information technology in all aspects of our daily lives, from medical records to banking information, from the remotely controlled electricity grids to the integrated control of air flights, from the networks of appliances and the Internet of Things, to the voting machines and the computers containing voters' personal data. All of these sectors have been targeted by one form of cyber attack or another, and with every fallout came a chilling reminder of just how much worse things could have been. Most of the governments have compiled lists and ranked sectors deemed critical infrastructure on the assumption that a materialized attack against any of them will affect the greatest number of citizens for an extensive period of time and might even permanently cripple national assets. And as exemplified above, the list of such sectors is bound to expand every time attackers identify new vulnerabilities to target. This means that we must try to be just as flexible as our opponents, and I'll get back to that when we will discuss strategic responses to cyber attacks. When seeking to answer the second question, an overreaching conclusion drawn from the analysis of cyber incidents proved that the advantage lies with the attacker, unfortunately. We should also remember that for quite a long time, the threats originating in the cyberspace were primarily linked with criminal enterprises, the so-called hacks seeking monetary returns and technology theft. Thus, the main response came initially from law enforcement authorities. It's only in recent times that we have witnessed the great expansion of players and the active use of cyber instruments in the pursuit of political and ideological objectives. Nation states and foreign terrorist organizations have developed expansive and increasingly sophisticated cyber arsenals. This sophistication has reached a level where states now employ proxies and some states and use tactics such as false flags in order to conceal the true source of attack and thus claim plausible deniability. In such circumstances, being reactive is no longer enough. One country that has a long history of cyber aggression against other nations is Russia. Cyber attacks attributed to Russian actors targeted other governments' strategic communication assets and internet services, as well known in Estonia, 2007, Georgia, 2008, critical infrastructure and especially the electricity grid, even in US, 2009, and Ukraine since 2014 and ongoing, political parties and campaign teams in order to interfere in the election processes of many countries in Europe and elsewhere. Finally, a last category of actors who have proven increasingly disruptive are the activists, of course. They may act alone or as a collective and can cause significant disruption. One element that increased the effectiveness of activists is the rise of commercial innovation outside of government supervision, which means that some of the most disruptive technologies are now publicly available. Today, hacking tools are traded almost as freely as licensed software, including antivirus protection. In Romania, the National Cyber Center identified cyber attacks that we know on analysis at the level of the intelligence services that can be attributed to states such as Red October, Miniduke, and Snake. The targets of the attacks were government agencies and ministries such as Foreign Affairs or the Defense Ministry. When it came, however, to critical infrastructure, Romania was either not targeted with persistent attacks or could easily brush away lower levels of intrusions. On the other hand, a ransomware attack spiked in 2017, and the effects of the infamous malware WannaCry, but also Jeff, Eternal Rocks, GoldenEye, or Bad Rabbit was also felt by Romanian companies and individuals. In fact, the Romanian Computer Emergency Response Team reported an increase of cyber alerts by 35% for the 6 months of this year compared to the similar period of 2016, with 31% of the total Romanian IPs being implicated in a cybersecurity alert. As a piece of good news, there is a regress of ideologically motivated cyber attacks in Romania, at least in terms of terrorism, due to a lack of local Islamist organizations or any specific objectives in this respect. A third question now, the most important, in my opinion, how to protect against cyber threats is difficult to answer. There is currently a debate, even in the US, concerning the way of addressing cyber threats to active defense as a posture between firewall and hackback. I would like to refer to you to the report released by the CCHS about the private sector and the active defense against cyber threats as a good template for cooperation between government agencies and private companies, as well as the implication and risk of active engagement. I know that a new bill has been recently introduced in the House of Representatives called the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, which seeks to amend the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Of course, we will follow closely the debates and the implication of such legislations for the overall cyber domain. From our perspective, a good way to approach this issue is through a multidimensional prepare, deter, defense strategy to combat cyber threats. Preparation to counter cyber threats includes early warning capabilities, building resilience, and focusing on education, training, and exercises. Deterrence is achieved by employing or trying to employ a full range of assets and instruments, including political isolation, economic sanctions, legal actions, and even the threat of military actions in case the intensity of a cyber attack can be defined in such a way. Defense will be employed, of course, when an aggressor has been exposed, and allied defense mechanisms are automatically employed. At this point of the discussion, I would like to delve a little deeper into the topic of hybrid warfare and the intersection with the cyber domain. According to one definition, hybrid warfare is based on a broad, complex, adaptive, and often highly integrated combination of conventional and unconventional means of overt and covert activities. Such activities are performed by military, paramilitary, irregular, and civilian actors, and they overcross a broad range of domains such as political, diplomatic, military, intelligence, economic, financial, media, and the use of information. Anyway, one of the main objectives of hybrid warfare is to maintain ambiguity over the principal long-term objectives that are being pursued. This, of course, was clearly illustrated during the Russian occupation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and I won't develop more on that, but just to add that Deployment of troops on the ground was always synchronized with the launch of cyber attacks, which included distributed denial of service attacks, defacement of Ukrainian websites, hacking of data systems, and malicious traffic rerouting of cyber espionage. Finally, propaganda and information manipulations are also key elements of hybrid warfare. These are instruments employed to exercise political and public pressure on decision makers. Disinformation or the manipulation of information is in my opinion and others, the insertion of narratives meant to support political and geopolitical actions of certain actors. Fake news have been referred often enough to raise awareness, but what I want to highlight is this insidious connection that triggers the cycle. Fake news, fake analysis based on this fake news, and ultimately fake conclusions that can lead to wrong decisions taken at the national level. Speaking of the use of social media to spread disinformation, I will just mention, for example, officially the Freedom House report released recently, Freedom on the Net 2017, Manipulating Social Media and to Undermine Democracy. And this report assessed internet freedom in 65 countries, which account for 87 of internet users worldwide for the period June 2016, May 2017. And it offers, in my opinion, a good overview of the state of play, and here are some of its key findings. Out of 65 countries surveyed, governments in 30 of them deployed some form of manipulation to distort online information. This is an increase from 23 countries last year. Manipulation techniques include paid commentators, trolls, bots, false news sites, and propaganda outlets. Fabricating stories that flood the social media have become another tool in the arsenal of information warfare. Online manipulation and disinformation tactics played an important role in elections in at least 18 countries, according to this report, over the last 12 months. This impacted citizens' ability to elect leaders based on true facts and authentic debate. Those are official data from this report that I find very interesting. Now, as a general outlook, I would like to focus a bit on Romania. Romania, of course, is a borderline ally guarding NATO eastern flank. As such, security concerns are extremely high on our political and social agendas, and cybersecurity is something we take very seriously. What I want to emphasize is the need for a holistic threat assessment. Otherwise, it will be impossible to understand the full scope of cyber challenges, motives, and threats for a country like Romania, placed in that geographical area. To be more specific, Romania's security environment must address a convergence of challenges and threats, and the cyber-related ones are an integral part of those challenges. The perpetuation of frozen conflicts on our borders is in no small part due to the use of propaganda and manipulation of information, for example, to make this connection between cyber and geopolitical realities on the ground. Likewise, the militarization of Crimea, which is taking place right now, for example, which is only 150 miles away from the shores of Romania, includes communication assets and cyber capabilities. In 2013, the Romanian government approved the first cybersecurity strategy, and it designated the national coordinating institution, the Cyber Int Center, and a nationally integrated system for prevention and reaction to cyber attacks. One of the lessons we learned is that timely access to all source intelligence is key to understanding the nature of the threat and adequate response in a constantly changing environment. That is why we adopted an integrated national cybersecurity center as one of the stop shop for operational cybersecurity. Furthermore, an independent computer emergency and incident response team is operational since February 2011. You mentioned, Frank, that I led the Romanian intelligence service for some years, and what I understood when this threat was emerging is the fact that we were pressed to introduce cyber skills as basic requirements for the intelligence tradecraft and develop cyber counterintelligence capabilities, because otherwise it's difficult to understand the the deep causes of some of the cyber security challenges that we have to face. I have also promoted the exchange of information and analysis between intelligence agencies based on the firm belief that shared intelligence in a timely manner can save a lot of trouble down the road. And this is, again, an open question and a very, very important aspect in the counter strategy to cyber, in my opinion. We'll see how this element develops internationally, but it's very, very important in my opinion. Governments and state agencies cannot and should not, because of that act alone, to address the myriad cyber threats or attempt to alleviate vulnerabilities. Public-private partnerships are a necessity in the current circumstances, in my opinion, and public-private partnerships are increasingly relevant in addressing systemic vulnerabilities and combating cyber threats. One of the most efficient mechanisms for cooperation is embedded in joint cyber exercises, for example. This year in Romania we launched CyDex 17, an exercise that brought together over 200 specialists from more than 60 public and private entities to the national cyber range to resolve a simulated cyber incident. And this cyber exercise will be held on an annual basis and is one of the main means Romania uses to bring the private companies on board as really national security partners in this field. The same principle, of course, applies among allies, I mentioned that, and partner countries, while the ultimate responsibility to address hybrid threats and cyber attacks rests upon the nation state. Both NATO and EU contribute to better coordinated responses and higher levels of resilience in those states. And there are a whole range, I won't get into them for the sake of time, of developments both in NATO and the European Union. There is a EU strategy on cyber. NATO, of course, after a summit in Wales, decided that cyber defense is part of the NATO core task as collective defense, which was a very important development. And in February 2016, NATO signed a technical arrangement on cyber defense cooperation with the European Union, just to have this coordination more structured, to jointly increase the ability to anticipate, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. I would just mention the fact that after the Wales summit, referring again to Romania, Romania assumed the lead nation role for the Trust Fund for Cyber Defense in Ukraine, which is very exposed to this security challenge. And as the executing agent, Romania is also responsible, of course, for the project's implementation in Ukraine. Also, since 2014, Romania is hosting the new Office for Cybercrime of the Council of Europe. I think it's important to mention this. And finally, Romania is a founding member of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise and co-initiator with Holland and Hungary of the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Initiative. There are some initiatives that we took also internationally besides our internal efforts to address these issues. I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to share with you those thoughts, and I'm ready to answer your questions and your commentaries. Thank you very much.
Please join me. Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for an amazing tour de force in terms of what Romania is engaged in, and more generally in terms of some of the cyber threats we're all facing collectively. And I want to make sure we have ample time for Q&A from the audience, but I thought I'd start with one or two initial questions. I mean, the first one being, and I'm glad you singled out the need for a cyber deterrent strategy, because that was sort of the missing dimension of our own cybersecurity approach here in the United States. I mean, we've all discussed the need for it. It's obviously more difficult to implement, but ultimately you deter actors, not necessarily cyber. And that means we need to collectively come together to acknowledge and recognize threats for what they are. And I'd be curious in terms of where you think NATO is going and the importance. And I think one thing that makes Romania so unique, and this was the benefit that I had visiting recently, is that you're not only looking west, but you also have all your Black Sea partners who are, yes. And clearly they were looking to Romania in terms of leadership and vision in terms of where you're going. But where do you see sort of that NATO alliance going? Do you see a more active defense approach being taken? And I'm supposed to have lunch with Soren today, actually, but I'm not. So I know they are leaning in that direction. And then specifically on the bilat with the United States, where can you see greater cooperation? What's ripe for greater cooperation, U.S.-Romania, Romania-U.S. on the cyber front?
Yeah, I think that deterrence is a special dimension when we speak about cyber. First of all, it's not conceptually equivalent with classical deterrence in the physical domain or the military domain. So we have to be very creative, and we have to be multi-dimensional in our approaches. From a serious assessment of the internal vulnerabilities we have in our critical infrastructures. And this means a serious analysis and serious implementations of preventive technologies in case of attacks. And resilience,
and right?
Resilience, of course. Yeah. And I think NATO did a good job in terms of, first of all, recognizing the threat posed by cyber, including cyber in its operational principles and capabilities. Now it's a time of, I believe, of more structured cooperation among allies inside NATO in terms of what I've mentioned, exchange of intelligence and analysis. And this is not only always very simple to achieve, because unfortunately, it's not the case of NATO, but when you exchange data and intelligence, governments tend to be let's say, more rigid in sharing that.
And sometimes for good reason.
And sometimes for good reasons, of course, but sometimes with bad effects.
Exactly.
In terms of our cooperation with U.S., I think cyber is one of the key elements in our cooperation. It's not only an aspect that involves sharing of data and intelligence. From that we saw that the sensitivities of the region, the Black Sea, with all those frozen conflicts with Russia, with Turkey, and cyber, it's part of this complexity related to the sensible security environment in the Black Sea area. So exchange of data and information is very, very important between two countries, and we do that with your government. Also, in operational terms, we have reached a level of coordination on certain significant targets, and I cannot develop more on this.
And I don't want you to.
Yes, yes, but this is important because sharing information is one aspect, acting it's another aspect which is so critically important. We have included also the cyber in the strategic dialogue among our two countries, so we have a cyber common task force at the level of Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the State Department, which discusses how to increase cooperation in this area all the time. It's a process that it's important for the national security of both countries, and I recognize that.
Do you envision, so there's a big push in the United States to go to automated information sharing, so AIS and other initiatives where you actually don't have to worry about compromising sources and methods, but it's sort of instantaneous. Do you envision that taking a more pan-European approach?
Not in the short term.
But maybe with other allied countries?
With some allied countries, yes. Again, it's more cooperation of this type is needed also in Europe. But it's not easy to achieve on a multilateral basis. It's easier to achieve.
Not even with international, I mean, between our various agencies.
It's easier to achieve at a bilateral level because of the two countries involved. But EU has done some steps in this respect, and the various, for example, intelligence agencies in Europe group under the Club de Berne are also taking cyber as a serious element of multilateral cooperation. But as you mentioned, it's interesting to see if in the future this type of approach will be extended in Europe also, automatically.
Because I've been a big proponent of late of what Europol has been doing, because it's actually operationalizing some of these activities, and whether it's botnet takedowns or whether it's all sorts of, that's a model I think that's worth looking at. And to be transparent, I'm friends with Rob Wainwright, and we've hosted them many times, but I do think that that is a good cross-border operationally focused mechanism to look at. And I'd be curious along those lines, in addition to government, and obviously one of the things, without getting into any details, I was most impressed with your colleagues at SRI was that they were able to integrate cyber not only technically but into human intelligence, because that's what governments can do. They can bring all source means to the problem, not just cyber forensics. But beyond the government to government, do you see a day where industry to industry, because obviously you've got, you're home to one of the great cybersecurity companies in terms of Bitdefender and the like, and I'd be curious, do you see a time where industry, bank to bank, energy to energy, can take a more proactive role in cybersecurity?
I certainly do, and I think we are obliged to do that.
I'm happy to hear that.
Not only because we want to do it, but we are obliged to do it because critical infrastructure more and more is first and foremost with the private sector in many countries. That's one element. I mentioned this notion, the private entities as national security partners. And this is a very important shift, in my opinion, in the entire, let's say, conceptualization of security in terms of the state assuming the central role, but also private entities that can be affected first and foremost themselves and being affected themselves, many citizens being affected because of that. So this type of responsibility is very important in the private sector, and I think they are aware of that more and more, and the dialogue between the state, the public sphere and the private sphere will only intensify.
It has to, right? Because they're on the front lines and they're defending against nation-state threats.
It has to, and they're defending themselves, the private and the state, and together the nation in terms of national security when speaking about cyber.
And economic security, which is inextricably interwoven.
Yeah.
One other question before I open it up, and Romania has been providing great support in Ukraine, and Ukraine's been, I think, rightfully, and I don't mean to be pejorative that it's a canary in a coal mine, but they have been the training grounds for Russian cyber activity for quite some time. Ukraine, yeah. Especially Eastern Ukraine. And if you think about the Rubicon was crossed with the attacks on the grid, which we all knew in theory were possible, but when you saw it play out in practice in both 2016 and 2015, I think that was a message that was sent, and it was meant not only for Ukraine, it was actually meant for the United States and for others in the region. It was a projection of power. But what lessons can we glean from there? And then I'm going to ask one cyber active measures kind of question, because you've got more experience than we do on that front. But what can we learn in terms of some of your good work supporting the Ukrainian authorities right now? Well,
first of all, the fact that the Ukrainian government recognizes the cyber field and the cyber cooperation with allies as an important part of their national security, because they were subject to intensive damage in this field. And that's good in itself. It's not an easy task. It's not progressing fantastically well, I must confess, because of various reasons. And again, the need to reform in Ukraine is also important, and that reform refers also to the relationship between the state and the private sector, which is not so much structured and developed than in some of the Western states. But things are moving. I think some positive effects we can already see in terms of Ukraine's capacities and own capabilities to take in their own hands security even in this area. Many other aspects have to be, however, implemented in order to have a solid national security, security environment in Ukraine.
Thank you. And one last question, then I open it up. And that is, so we're launching a project looking at what we refer to as cyber active measures. And obviously Russia's not the only perpetrator in this domain, but they tend to be one of the most active, if not the most active. And this is not a secretive issue. This is a very public kind of issue. And the question I always ask is, why don't we put together a tapestry? Every country has had a similar story of cyber-enabled influence, meant not only at the government, but to undermine credibility in these governments. If we put together a storyboard of all the European countries, all the Black Sea partners, that would be a pretty compelling story. So I'd be curious, what have you seen? And I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on the U.S. That's delicate enough of a set of issues. But we've seen enough. And the problem is when we talk deterrence, if there are no consequences for bad behavior is going to continue and continue. And then we're going to act surprised when we get kicked in the most obvious place next year. So I'd be curious, what lessons have you seen that could bear some fruit to U.S. thinking around these issues? And then collectively, can't we put together that storyboard?
Yeah, this is very important and complicated question, but it's important to approach it first and foremost. Indeed, we have witnessed, not only in Romania, but in Central and Eastern Europe, this tendency to use cyber combined with really active measures in the classical sense and in this postmodern sense that is given by cyber. This is very dangerous for a society. And what were the objectives? Well, first and foremost, to create this unity among allies, to create a lack of confidence in governments trying to cooperate inside the European Union or inside the NATO. For example, a story that is clearly an effect of such measures is the fact that we've increased our defense budget to 2%, and the counter story, counter narrative is, why don't you use that money for education, for health? It's a waste of money, it's an aggressive posture. So many examples of such kind. I think countries are trying.
They did weigh in specifically to the 2% debate. Interesting.
Exactly. Yes. Not
Right,
to
the
speak
wedge with
about
the US.
not to speak about certain ideas in terms of classical deterrence we are doing right now. For example, the modernization of the military in terms of Patriot acquisitions. So. But those are concrete examples. I think countries can put together, and each has a certain specificity, of course, in that region, but there are common trends and common aspects that are being targeted. And in terms of countermeasures, I think we should be more courageous in undertaking a strategy to counteract. We have legitimate goals to be, let's say, inserted in the international narrative, and we can use in a democracy such instruments for the pursuit of those legitimate goals, which are democratic goals. But this is a very sensitive debate, unfortunately, sometimes wrongly understood by some actors inside the democratic society. And it can lead to controversial attitudes. But we have to have courage to undertake such a strategy, in my opinion.
And I agree with you, and I hope countries do step, because ultimately, I think we here have missed part of that story. It wasn't about the election per se alone. It's about undermining democracies.
Yes, exactly.
And the very principle, and for us to question ourselves so we can't focus on other problems. So I do think that demands a international, transnational, not only transatlantic, even beyond.
Yeah, even beyond.
So I hope that we can step up. I want to make sure we have time for some questions. We've got a very senior group in the audience here, and if you do have a question, please raise your hand. Wait a second. Danielle, can we wait 1 second for a mic? And please identify yourself as well.
Thanks. I'm Danielle Kriz with the cybersecurity company Palo Alto Networks. We're active
Just
in
a little
Europe.
company.
Little company. And we're active in Romania as well. And Ambassador, thank you for your remarks. It's amazing everything your country's done, both policy and operationally, the last few years. And I know that in a little more than a year from now, you take over the presidency of the EU. It will be your first time.
Yes.
And wondering if you have any thing you can share on the country's plans to promote cybersecurity throughout the EU. I know Estonia is doing a great job now, pushing a lot of
You've got a colleague
policy.
next to you from Estonia.
And then we have Bulgaria and Austria, and then your country. So would love any light you can shine on how you plan to really move that forward in Europe.
Thank you. That's a very good, thank you for your question. And we have tried in NATO to introduce for a long time cyber as an element of discussion. I remember 2007, 2008, when This was a very elusive concept.
Oh, yeah.
We were very, very constructive and pushing, among other countries, the Baltics, of course, to introduce this subject. And now you see this element strongly inside NATO. EU is the same thing. Indeed, we held the presidency in 2019. We are structuring our priorities and our mandate right now. It will be a very complicated period, I must say, because we have the Brexit discussion and negotiation, and if things go as they are planned, Romania will preside over the conclusion of those negotiations. You can imagine how much political energy will be devoted to that. But of course, in my opinion, cyber should be one of the priorities during our presidency as a mandate, and certainly myself in the debate I will be a proponent of that. It's too soon to say now.
And sort of, not to GDPR and some of the other, and it's not to suggest that we are looking at it too much through a regulatory lens, but it tends that we fall in love with process, not always outcome.
Yes.
One thing that I found unique about the Romanian approach was the outcome and integrating it into operations. I hope you bring that same mindset and rigor to the presidency. So
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? Please identify yourself if you do, please, and wait for a mic. So.
Mr. Ambassador, Carl Cook with Norfolk Grumman Corporation, another small company.
small.
I would like to perhaps very much enjoyed your comments, particularly addressing hybrid warfare. And you briefly mentioned the upcoming Patriot acquisition that Romania is doing. So I'd like to hear your thoughts with regarding the nexus between cyber and integrated air and missile defense, because that is arguably a very key tie-in to that. And given some of the history of Patriot deployments in Turkey, where the Patriot systems, the batteries of the Germans were hacked, if you could say a little bit about some of the thoughts about the criticality of protecting those areas, and particularly the key node that Romania hosts at Devesalu, the Aegis Ashore site for NATO BMD. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. It's very important. There are several aspects to this, from the protection as such of those critical systems, and this is, of course, an aspect associated with the acquisition and installation of those systems that will be taken very seriously into account, to have the cyber elements, security elements attached to this acquisition. That's clear. To the cyber elements of disinformation and attacks that we had to withstand during the process of the deployment of the missile defense system in Devesalu, you've mentioned. I mean, trying to undermine the logic, first of all, the strategic logic of the missile defense, then to induce the idea, which is false, that it's against Russia, which is not, and then even to try to create a sense of, induce in the public opinion the idea that we will be more vulnerable as a state with such a system on our territory. So those were detected as elements pertaining to propaganda or disinformation. It happened in other states in Central European states, in Poland, in the Czech Republic. And
Still happening?
Yes, it's still happening, yes. But a very good point.
You know, I just came back from Japan, and talk about missile an actor in Pyongyang, and it happened to be a bilat Japan-Israel, so you had all the Israeli leadership there, and they were looking at sort of a cyber equivalent Iron Dome kind of approach that would get into some of the C4ISR, the broader missile defense, but also purely from a cyber perspective. So there are some interesting ways to integrate, as we see our adversaries doing, integrate electronic warfare into their warfighting strategy and doctrine. And I might note that's precisely what we are seeing. I mean, some of the Chinese investments are pretty incredible in terms of space and quantum computing and the like. I want to use that to ask, though, another question. So, and this is not meant to be naive, but I had always known of Romania's prowess as hackers. So you had some of the most sophisticated hackers globally, and I think part of that is because you have a strong S&T, science and technology, math, science, STEM, early education, and hacking need not be good or bad. It's on the intent or the motive around that. But you seem to have turned that into a strength, including some in the leadership were former, they weren't necessarily at the time white hat hackers, but talk to me about what that looks like, because how do you turn that into a strength? And I think it is a strength.
Yeah. Well, good question. It was one of our main problems, I think, in the 2005 to...
They're the best in the world. They honestly were among the best.
To deal with those hackers, really creative and doing a lot of damage in terms of our positioning in this field. So I think we manage as internal institutions enforcing a law to get this thing under control. On the other hand, you should know that Romania has the highest percentage of graduates in IT engineering in Europe.
I did not know that.
Yes, and very creative young engineers working in this area. Some of them co-opted to work inside those new sophisticated institutions of the state, like the Cyberint I've mentioned, just for their own pride to work in a state institution, but also to work with sophisticated technologies. However, a problem that we have is that many of them, after a while, will leave the state sector and go to the private sector abroad. And I visited recently, for example, Seattle and that part of US, and was amazed to see how many young Romanian engineers working in Microsoft or Amazon or
we'll take it.
Other companies. Well, someday
They'll come
get
back,
hopefully. But anyway, it's an issue in Romania to have IT as a priority in terms of education and training in our polytechnical school and universities, and some parts of Romania are becoming now a hub in terms of IT development, a hub in Central and Eastern Europe, and that's important for the evolution of the country.
And especially not just at the higher ed, but at the K through 12, at the early pre-gymnasium, and something the Estonians do very well.
They do very well.
And I hope to see that. I hope to see the U.S. follow suit in some of that, because STEM is not necessarily our strong suit. What about women in cyber? So here in the U.S., I feel that's a massively missed opportunity. I mean, we don't have enough women focused on STEM and cyber. How about in Romania?
It's interesting. I had that discussion with Amazon, for example, recently in Seattle. They have an initiative in Romania, women in IT, in cyber, which is very popular.
Oh, good.
And I believe that this is a great potential that is sometimes neglected. I don't want to dwell into the sociological aspects or other reasons, but really, in Romania, I think we have a more balanced approach from this point of view. I don't have statistics, but I think so.
But it's better than here. We have a question. Please wait for a mic here.
Thank you. My name is Charles McGarry. I recently retired 30 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, so I know a little bit of this type of activity. I'm now an executive with one of the larger IT companies serving the defense and intelligence sectors in the government. So I'd like to return to the issue of deterrence. There's usually, when we speak of deterrence in the cyber world, we're talking counter tools, you know, the actual application of electrons in some form or fashion. If I could ask you to address kind of the idea of deterrence in the information operation realm. Conceptually, you would think that's kind of a necessity. We can't keep chasing after every incident. We at some point have to deter our opponents from engaging in that type of activity. Conceptually, what would that look like from your perspective?
Well, doing in cyber in the cyber field, what we're doing in the classical counterintelligence area. I want to develop more, but we need to do that, and we're obliged to do that. Otherwise, we'll, as you say, just run after various actors that are doing damage, and nobody's getting a response, and that will continue. We have to be creative in this respect. We have to acknowledge that we were slow to move sometimes, some countries in the intelligence area, to recognize this as a field of operations. Now some countries are trying to introduce new innovative elements like virtual, of course, spying, virtual counterintelligence, all sorts interaction inside an organization like this, combination of virtual agents with real agents on the field, and the linkage between them. It's not easy, however, to restructure organizations like ours in this respect. It takes time, it takes training, it takes resources, it takes a lot of new technology to be shared inside and the organization. That means resources. But clearly, in terms of deterrence, it's not the same old type of deterrence we are applying in the classical deterrence, not all type in the military area. It's a new type of deterrence that we have to define, and we have to be courageous again in terms of our own mission to do real things in response to bad things that are happening to us.
And I'm glad you, because ultimately that has to be part of it, right? So we can't just opine and admire the problem if there are no consequences. And it's not just Russia. Again, others are reading into that, hey, fair game, and obviously the message and the signal is loud and clear. So this is an area where I think combining arms becomes that much more important.
And there are other states that are more, even more, I won't need sophisticated and devoting more resources to that.
Yeah, I mean, long term, I mean, that is, I mean, when we think about, so I mean, all nations, basically any country that has a modern military has a cyber capability.
Yes.
And the question is, how many are willing to utilize cyber to achieve their objectives? And right now, it seems that if they were to do the same in a physical environment, we know what that would demand, but we don't necessarily make the same call when it comes to cyber activity. So please, we have a question here, and we just have time for a couple more. And John.
Bună dimineața. My name is Tiag Inghoff. I'm with Bank of America. On that note, I would like to have your opinion on cyber norms and where we go on cyber norms. I know it's not the most successful story in recent history, but given also the pivot of the US administration of being more on the bilateral negotiation terms and the EU obviously favoring a much multilateral approach, where do you see these cyber norms going forward? Is it the G20, is it the G7, and what is Romania's view on this?
Thank you. It's a difficult question because it's first and foremost, it's a lack of an international or even a regional regime in terms of defining this field legally. That is clearly needed. We have the manual, Tallinn manual, for example, making recommendations and have instituting some norms. We have some elements in EU multilaterally, but not a clear regime, a legal regime in this respect. We have national legislations, even there, some of them not very solid, not adaptive, at least to the threat, in my opinion. I myself had a bad experience in this respect because I proposed a very, in my opinion, advanced legislation to tackle comprehensively this threat back in 2013 or 14.
When you were in the Senate? Oh, when you were at
When I was
SRI.
SRI, and was adopted by Parliament, but it was rejected by the Constitutional Court for, now it's adapted to standards, but again, it's a very good question. I think at least in Europe and at least in the transatlantic area, we should have a solid discussion on this and try to get to some sort of a treaty on basic elements defining what is aggression, what is what are the national security implications, what are the possible legal instruments that can be used in terms of deterrence or responses, so many, many things that I am sorry to say that we are not very structured and developed in this area internationally and regionally.
You know, and because I mean, obviously we emphasize, and I think it's strong to emphasize bilateral relationships, but there are some unique considerations vis-a-vis cyber. And do we need new alliances? I mean, the threat is different, and when we think of the Five Eyes, I think people misconstrue what that, it's just history. It's a lot of scar tissue fighting the same battles against the same enemy for a long time. But when we look at cyber, do we need new structures? Do we need new alliances? When I think about it globally, obviously we need to integrate cyber into existing treaties, structures, and the like. But I think there also are some very unique cyber needs here, and it's not so the question is, what does that look like? And I think our State Department is struggling with what that looks like right now. But I'd be curious what, and none of this is to take away from bilats, but maybe there is a need, and not to throw the question back, but you know, bank to bank might be, so maybe building the FS ARC and FS ISAC sort of concept transatlantically, that's the future. I want to hear that again.
But the discussion.
The discussion is happening, okay. But ultimately, you do need to tie that into some of the gov-to-gov sort of activity. So I guess it's not meant to be too philosophical. But
no, you have to be dynamic in this area, very flexible. You need alliances clearly for the sake of your national security and regional security, and you need even not to formalize those alliances in some rigid, let's say, formula classically applied to the notion of alliance as such, but to have ad hoc alliances in cases of emergency that transcend simple cooperation and simple exchange of information and try to get together to tackle the threat.
Because ultimately it's about trust, right?
It's
I mean, I
about
don't care
trust,
what
yeah.
structure you have in place.
It's about trust.
And that's hard to earn and easy to lose. So even within our own agencies, it's not
I know.
to even look beyond our borders. But I do think the lifeline sectors of our critical infrastructure. So not all critical infrastructure is equally critical. We've designated 16 sectors critical. And it's not to take away from that. They're all really important. But some are more important than others, where our economy or our national security could truly be undermined. So maybe it is looking bank, energy, telecommunications, all of which I know already have some of these partnerships. But then they're the softer targets that quite honestly are not up to par, like water, and some of these others that are critical to modern economies but aren't necessarily up to pace. We had a question here, and then a question here, and then a question there, and we're going to have to cut it off there, but please identify yourself.
Good morning. My name is Dori Montiano. I'm with Transylvania Group. This is a small advisory firm based here in Washington, D.C., assisting Central Eastern European technology-driven innovation talent to access the U.S. market. You gentlemen earlier mentioned the industry-to-industry cooperation's necessity and obligation, if I may quote. Could you please expand a little bit on this, and how do you see this moving forward? If you give us just a couple examples. And one more question. If there's any more updates related to the Cybersecurity Innovation Center, first one in Europe, established by the United States government in 2014, jointly with General Dynamics, if I remember correctly. I haven't heard about that lately, so thank you.
Well, defense, industry to industry, it's a very dynamic field. I mentioned that. In terms of my topic, our topic today is cyber security. I think this is an area that needs further interaction commercially, but also from a cooperative stand among private actors also that are interested in protecting themselves, their clients, their own citizens ultimately. And it's an area that will really evolve and progress. To your second question, I don't have an answer now. I will convey an answer when I get more documented.
Please. And just wait for the mic. It's coming, and then to John.
Manuela Mott, I'm from the World Bank. I have a question related to Romania. What are the lessons Romania has learned from recent cyber attacks, cyber threats around the world? And I refer here to US elections, French elections. And I'm asking that in light of the fact that we are going to have elections in a couple of years. We are going to host the EU presidency in a year. We are having important energy-related activities in the country, oil drilling, exploitations in the Black Sea, and also we are hosting important defense equipment. So it's something that we should be aware in the, next year or so, and what we should focus on, especially that you have mentioned some partnership with private entities. Thank you.
I think my entire expose relates to this, to be prepared, to deter, to invest resources in this area. We need to do that. Indeed, you mentioned well, we have many challenges ahead. Elections, presidency of the EU. So our institutions have to adapt, develop, and be capable of responding to those challenges that we have to face. Until now, we did that rather well, I would say, from a national security standpoint.
How about your interaction with social media providers in particular? So that's a hotly debated issue in the United States right now vis-a-vis Facebook, Twitter, and entities that historically weren't seen as vehicles for media, but are now having greater influence than traditional media. Is that something you guys struggle with, or you think you've got your arms around that?
Well, it's a very significant dynamic in social media in Romania. Freedom of expression.
Like everywhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, like everywhere else. We must be wise enough to try to detect if foreign elements or cyber intrusions would affect these fields in a way or another, and I think we'll do it that well in terms of disinformation, in terms of what I said, manipulation.
Because one of the things that Facebook is going to be doing from here on out is to start being transparent in who's paying for ads. That I think is a valuable.
It is.
So at least you know, you can go with whatever you want to click. No one's suggesting that people shouldn't read what they want to read, but they should know where it's coming from and
Yes,
who's propagating that. So hopefully that is helpful to at least know where data is disseminated. John, you've got the last word, the last question. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, John Lanehart from the Center for Cybersecurity and Homeland Security, Frank Center. Question about technology. How can it help us here? You've mentioned that a lot of people are leaving your country and going to, Seattle, as an example. We're talking about the lack of women in technology, and also the issue of continuous diagnostics, mitigation. How can technology help us? And I'm thinking, artificial intelligence in particular. How can that be a game changer for us to help meet some of these critical needs?
No, you're right. I think it's critical. I think it's evolving. I think technology is part of the answer, but also the individual is the other part of the answer. Mm-hmm. Not only technology, but our own strategies, our own human resources and creativity put into in relationship with technology. I think it's difficult for the state to stay ahead of the evolution of technologies in the private sector, and that's a problem we have to address. That is why, again and again, reiterate, going back to this basic concept of cooperation as national security partners between the state and the private sector, and that relates also to technology, in my opinion. I mean, without this, we are very exposed, both the private and the state.
Well said, and obviously same concern we share here in the United States. I do think you're going to see some significant changes in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and just the ability to share information in real time. But even then, it's never going to be 100%. There's never going to be a foolproof technological solution. But if we do develop one, I want to develop it with Romania. I want to make sure that we get the Romanian firms front and center here, because I think you do bring a ton to the fight, a ton to the table, and most importantly, thank you for your service. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for coming back to the campus at GW.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jump in next time.